Hi everyone, and welcome back to Venus Pages. Today we're talking about chapters 3 to chapter 5 of Death in Venice by Thomas Mann. And if you haven't seen the video already, please do check it out because we talk about the first two chapters somewhere here. And with that, let's dive straight into the analysis. Chapter 3. Of course, being the disciplined man he is, Gustav can't quite leave straight away. He can't just go to Venice suddenly and abandon, so he's tied back for a couple more weeks by social and literary affairs, but then eventually he decides to head straight to the Adriatic. The reason he decides to head to the Adriatic is because he was seeking something alien and disrelated to his usual life, which would at the same time be quickly within reach. Because of course he wants to be adventurous and not too adventurous. And it's beautiful and there are natives and it's exotic, but there is rain and heavy Austrian provincial patronage, as he describes it, and there's no soft sandy beach, and he decides that, well, there's not actually any intimacy here, and he finds himself feeling restless. It's not exactly what he wanted, and so he begins to look into himself, as intellectuals often do, and ask himself, well, what do you want, Gustav, then? And so he decides that actually, as a thing both astounding and self-evident, his goal was before him. If he wanted to reach overnight the unique, the fabulously different, where did you go? And of course, Venice is the answer. So he finds a ship and immediately he's greeted by this dirty sailor and a man who looks like a circus-style director, and he theatrically declares that of course it's Venice, of course it's an amazing destination, it's a, quote, city of irresistible attractiveness for the educated on account of its history as well as its present-day charms. So Gustav climbs aboard onto the ship and happily heads off to Venice. And what is he to do on a ship when bored but of course to watch his fellow passengers. Amongst these fellow passengers is a crowd of loud young men. They're the loudest, they're the happiest, they're the most jovial, they're the most cheerful because they're finally on vacation. And so Gustav begins to look more closely at this crowd of super loud men, and suddenly he declares one of them a cheat. He's old and his crimson cheeks are actually painted red with rouge, and he's wearing a yellow wig and his yellow teeth are like plated and his hands are wrinkled, and so Gustav watches fascinated with loathing and thinks, how can his friends not realize that he should, the quote, wearing their bright foppish clothes, that he was not entitled to play at being one of them? And yet, here this crowd of young men is laughing along at this old guy, and they seem to be having the best time of their lives. They don't even care that he's old. They don't even care that he's cheating them. And the word entitled is significant in this description here because Gustav thinks that nobody is entitled to anything. Nobody is entitled to happiness. It's something that is forged. And Gustav gets so tired and so worked up staring at this man, because why should this old man be having as much fun as these young people here? I, Gustav, am not having so much fun. And so worked up, he begins to have a headache and he rubs his forehead and he realizes, oh, he's probably tired. So he tries to sleep, but throughout his sleep, his dream is constantly disturbed by the thoughts of this old man pretending to be young. And the weather is poor and the food is bad, and he keeps thinking of this old man, and he just hopes that the sky will be brighter in Venice that has always received him in full blaze. But no, the sky is dreary still, and he can't help but remember how he was greeted in his youth by Venice, how the tall domes of the city spiraling up to the sky seemed to him so romantic and so full of life and promise and artistic fulfillment, and greeted him and he was enthusiastic and full of revelry. And now he can't help but think, oh, how dreary the sky looks, and is Venice really the place for me? Is it really the same Venice that I left so many years ago? Gustav is aged mentally. He's not like the old man. Unlike the old man, he's fully repressing himself and his desires. He lives a life of discipline. He can't just laugh along freely with young men. It's not according to his age. And so he finds himself thinking, is Venice really the place for me? And perhaps the weather is an example of pathetic fallacy. It's dreary, it's miserable, it's just like his voyage here, and it's filled with uncertainty. But he's distracted from his gloom easily by the beautiful signs of San Marco, seeing these columns, these pillars, these majestic domes, and yeah, suddenly everything is just a little bit better, and he thinks to himself happily, of course the way to Venice is by sea. He congratulates himself. He's like, yeah, I knew it. The way to Venice is by sea. I am comfortably where I should be. And so he gets off the ship and he's in happier and better spirits, and suddenly this old man whom he has literally been despising the entire trip, walks up to him and wishes him a good journey. And he's left a bit shocked and thinks to himself, oh, like, how fake, how uncomfortable this interaction is. But he tells himself he's in Venice, what use is thinking about this old man, and he finds that the gondolas look like coffins. And of course, gondolas crossing the river is seemingly like the gondolier is a reference to Sharon in his dark clothes crossing the river to the land of the dead from the land of the living. And so he gets onto a gondola and notices that he's a man of unpleasant, even brutal appearance. He's dressed in sailor blue, he's wearing a formless straw hat, and he doesn't really look particularly happy. And so Gustav tells him, like, off we go in that direction. He wants to take the vaporetto, and then the man declares, no, because you have luggage, we can't do this. And he just ignoring Gustav and going wherever he sees fit. And so Gustav is suddenly so irritated by this man's tone. Why is he so self-righteous? Why does he think he knows everything? Perhaps he's still irritated by the encounter with the old man, and so he orders him to turn back because he notices that the man is muttering to himself. And so he decides that he's being scammed, and he asks the gondolier how much he will charge him, and the gondolier simply turns around and says very brutally and very threateningly, "You will pay." Gustav refuses to pay until they reach the destination, to which the gondolier simply says, well, I rowed you well. And Gustav grudgingly admits to himself that actually, yeah, that is true, he did row him well. And they're sailing along in awkward silence when suddenly they see a boat of musical performances. And actually, again, everything is just not too bad. And notice how volatile Gustav's mood is looking at this. He's constantly like, this sucks. Oh no, but Venice is so beautiful. So he is feeling very uncertain in his surroundings. He's unsure of how to proceed because it's the first time he's been overwhelmed by this erratic desire to travel. Usually he represses his desires and simply works away and slaves away. But perhaps he's ready for a change in his life, which is why he's behaving this way. And so they arrive to the hotel and he tells the man, wait here with my things, I'll go inside and get the money and I'll come out and pay. And he goes inside, but when he comes out, the man is gone. Luckily, his luggage is not stolen. The man has simply left it at the pier and left away. And so Gustav is confused, like, we had all this arguments going here, why didn't the man even wait for the pay? And so he asks the man who's working at the hotel, and he tells him, well, actually, it's a very bad man. He doesn't even have a license. It's a good thing that you're okay. Like, don't ride with this man. And so they give Gustav a hotel room. The hotel is actually full, so he's relocated to another one and given this nice room with a sea view and strong smelling flowers. But even amidst all this beauty, he notices that when he's alone, his thoughts are far heavier. Loneliness brings forth what is original, daringly and shockingly beautiful, the poetic. But loneliness also brings forth the perverse, the disproportionate, the absurd, and the illicit. So he's left uneasy with the experience of the gondolier getting here, with the old man pretending to be young. Never mind that, he decides, I will go off to enjoy my well-deserved holiday. So he goes off to take tea on the terrace and once again begins to people watch. He notices this group of Russian families, French families, British families, but it's a Polish family that catches his attention. It's a governess with 3 girls, and the girls are somewhere between 15 to 17, and they're all very stiffly and properly and formally dressed. And there's a boy of about 14, and it's this boy that becomes the, like, focus of this book, his obsession. With astonishment, Ashbach noticed that the boy possessed perfect beauty. His face, pale and reserved, framed with honey-colored locks, the straight sloping nose, the lovely mouth, the expression of sweet and godlike seriousness recalled Greek sculpture of the noblest period, and the complete purity of the forms was accompanied by such a rare personal charm that, as he watched, he felt that he had never met with anything equally felicitous in nature or the plastic arts. And particularly, Gustav is struck by the fact that while the girls seem to be under an ironic turn of fate, dressed like nuns, the boy is dressed so freely. He has curls, he has puffy wrists, he has this sailor suit that fits nicely around his slim hands. His sisters are so stiff and proper with their back upright and sitting rod straight, while the boy is so relaxed and easygoing and free. And so Gustav wonders if he's ill because his skin is so white and he stands out compared to his dark hair. And he thinks that he's simply a pampered favorite, but he forgives him, because as Mann writes, almost every artist is born with a lush and treasonous tendency to look with tolerance upon injustices which have created beauty and to meet aristocratic advantages with sympathy and reverence. Then suddenly the mother comes in and beckons for them to follow from the governess, and the children obediently get up and leave straight after. And as the boy turns around, he looks at Gustav with his strange, dusky eyes. And although it was not a strange scene, of course, to have a mother get up and beckon for her children to follow, he's stunned by it. He intellectually observes the scene and thinks suddenly of beauty, form, and art. So the simple interaction begins to prompt him towards a creative musing, which he has not felt for a long time. He has felt stifled in his creativity. He did not have such thoughts back in Munich, and yet the simple interaction of a family going about their daily business has suddenly left him so emotional. But then he feels like he's tired, he's worn out, and he goes back to the hotel and he sleeps it off, and he has a headache and he feels numb. And when he wakes up eventually, he finds that the weather does not improve, and so he heads to breakfast. He sits on a table and suddenly notices, oh look, there's that exact family, except the boy is missing. Gustav smiled. Well, little Phoenician, he thought, you seem to be enjoying the pleasant privilege of having your sleep out. And suddenly exhilarated, he recited to himself the line from the Odyssey, a frequent change of dress, warm bath, and rest. So he sits there without hurry, taking his time with his tea. Is he already at this stage admitting that he's waiting for Tazio? Perhaps because eventually he sees the boy wander in, and this is the moment when he feels inspired by Tazio. He observes every tiny detail. He notices even the way that the boy walks, the way that he holds his posture, his back, the way that he walks forward, and he says Aschenbach was again astonished, terrified even by the really godlike beauty of this human child. Again he looks at his clothes and he notices that this time he's wearing a light blue and white striped blouse. He's wearing a red silk tie with a collar. His head is like an Eros, like God, like this god of love. And I think Nabokov could have been perhaps inspired by these descriptions of clothes in Lolita, because one of the biggest focal points of Lolita is exactly the way that the girl is dressed. If you look at it closely, in most of the book there is not any kind of sexual desire towards her that's openly admitted. It's just noticing every tiny detail about her appearance and her behavior. And after this encounter, Gustav is cheered up and he's entertained more than ever. And unlike this morning when he was thinking, oh, maybe I should leave this hotel, I'm having a headache and the weather is not so good, he decides to stay. And so he begins to look at the ocean and think, oh, how much he loves this ocean. It's something I want to seek refuge in. It's something vast, it's something boundless, whereas my life is the opposite. It's perfection. The ocean is beauty, and, quote, to be at rest in the face of perfection is the hunger of everyone who's aiming at excellence, and what is nothingness if not a form of perfection? So he begins to look at the ocean and think deeply and romantically. And I think it's important to note that the ocean could be interpreted as a symbol of the unconscious. So perhaps his unconsciousness is actually admitting to himself that he's longing for Tadzio, that he's longing for the young boy. And it's this that's making him wanting to stay, rather than some sudden deep-rooted love for the ocean. And so he's looking out, and his musings are interrupted by the walking past and looking at a happy Russian family and scorning them. So Tadzio walks straight in, looks at this happy family, and just scorns them. And Gustav is shocked because he feels that this is an intimate moment that reveals the boy's actual character. Something in this makes the boy appear more mature, more serious. Gustav thinks he's scorning this family for being happy, for not seeing each other's flaws. There's something serious, there's something adult-like. And so that's when he begins to observe the boy further, and he notices that on the beach he's so popular and everybody wants to play with him, and he has so many playmate friends who are just dashing around and calling his name, and he begins to listen, and he thinks that the boy's name is something like Agio, to snack on ripe strawberries. Ah, fruit and homosexuality, the early symbol long before the beach scene in Call Me By Your Name. So he decides to think more on what the boy's name is, and he recalls some distant Polish and thinks that actually there's a name called Tadzio, so perhaps it's that. And meanwhile, Tadzio, and I think it's significant that he never actually finds out what the boy's name is. It's just something that he's projecting from his earlier memories of learning Polish in the distant future. So Tadzio swims out into the sea, and the women are scared and they start calling him back, like the governesses, the other nuns on the beach, and he swims back virginally graceful and unripe, with dripping curls and lovely as some slender god, came up out of the depths of sky and sea, rose and separated from the elements, performance. The spectacle aroused the sense of myth. It was like some poet's recovery of time and its beginnings of the origin of forms and the birth of gods. In short, Gustav has it bad, because even when he's not deliberately observing the boy, he's aware of his every action and his every movement. And perhaps it's because Gustav, as described by Mann, has devoted his life to the search of beauty. So when he sees beauty, he feels this paternal affection. Well, at first it's paternal affection. Beauty calls to beauty. And later on he gets in the lift and he feels this sudden sense of, oh my gosh, because the family is there. He can't contain his emotions. He feels his heart beating faster. He's excited. He wants to speak. He wants to take a deep breath, and he sees Tadzio, but instead he just silently stands there and observes him. And Tadzio smiles or grins or opens his mouth, and in that movement he sees his teeth that are jagged and pale, and honestly they look kind of sickly, and so he decides, yes, of course the boy must be ill. Look at his skin, look at his unhealthy teeth. But there's a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing that the boy is ill, because he decides, this boy, yes, he will not live to old age. And it's interesting here, is it that he's happy that the boy will not live to old age because he has this terrible desire towards young children, or is it really because he's disgusted by aging and his repressed consciousness is telling him that he does not want to age because of his own personal fear of some kind? And driven by this encounter, he goes off to Venice, but he finds that the weather is so hot and sultry, perhaps like his desires, and he can't bear the heat. Passion, in a fit of unexpected decision making, he decides, oh, screw this, I'm going home. So he books his tickets on the ferry back, and he goes back to the hotel and he tells them that he'll be leaving early the next morning. On his way out, he sees Tadzio, who lowers his eyes modestly and then raises them again in his delicious manner, soft and full, upon him, and he had passed. He leaves. But then as he gets to the station, he's suddenly so angered that he's been defeated by Venice. Surely he's not that old. And he feels foolish because he's like, surely I will not be physically defeated twice. I have barely gotten here. I've barely begun to travel. But his pride will not permit him to turn back, to question his decision, and so he delays and delays and delays even though he's gotten to the station. And then he eventually decides to ask, where is my luggage? Only to find out that it's been shipped in the wrong direction, and he's not at all upset about it. And so he heads back to the hotel and declares that he will wait for his luggage, and he's promptly given another room, and he's honestly not too content. And then he suddenly sees Tadzio heading up from the beach. Aschenbach recognized him from this attitude before he had actually set eyes on him. He was about to think some such words as, well, Tadzio, there you are again, but at the same moment he felt this careless greeting go dumb before the truth in his heart. He felt the acceleration of his blood, a conflict of pain and pleasure, and he realized that it was Tadzio who had made it so difficult for him to leave. He sits still, he reflects. He raises his hands and turns the palms up in a spontaneous gesture of welcome and calm acceptance. It's the first time that he admits, it's Tadzio. It's because of Tadzio that I don't want to leave. Chapter 4. And so Gustav returns to the hotel, unable to leave due to Tadzio, and in fact he does not even consider the return of his luggage a reason to finally head home, and he unpacks for an indefinite period of time, and he finds that actually he's satisfied here. He likes the beach, he likes this warm environment, and he's not driven as usual to escape this vacation and be driven into rigorous toil, because actually he's enjoying himself for once. He's letting himself slip, and it's the sign that his discipline is slowly crumbling away as he's giving more and more into this desire. And he sees young Tadzio frequently and constantly, and he can't escape from him seemingly anywhere he goes, and indeed he considers himself lucky when he sees the boy. Tadzio becomes his guarantee of happiness, this daily recurrence of good fortune which made his stay here so precious and gave him such pleasure in the constant procession of sunny days. He was up as early as he used to be when under the driving of pressure of work, and was on the beach before most people. In short, Tadzio replaces his routine. It's not this energy of the hours he has accumulated from sleep that he's spending on writing, it's this energy that he's in fact spending on Tadzio. And he just keeps watching the boy in his swimsuit and how he beautifully swims out, and then how he's constantly looking for things and shells on the beach, and then, like, because he's a young boy, running to tell his governesses and his nuns so excitedly what he found on the beach that day. And Gustav understands none of this. It's in Polish, but to him it's a most delightful music, it's a most delightful harmony. Whereas before he was listening to people talk in Russian, French, and English and thinking, oh, I can't understand, what is this cacophony of noise? Suddenly it's the most delightful melody. And chapter 4 centers a lot around Gustav's admiration for Tadzio, his beauty. The sun made the down on his back glitter, the fine etching of the ribs, the symmetry of the chest showed through the fresh thinly covering his torso. His armpits were still as smooth as those of a statue, the hollows of his knee glistened, and their bluish veins made his body seem built of some clearer stuff. What rigor, what precision of thought were expressed in this erect, youthfully perfect body! Yet the pure and strenuous will which darkly at work could bring such godlike sculpture to the light. Was not he the artist at home with this? Was it not working in him too when under the pressure of an abstemious passion he would free from the marble mass of speech some slender form which he had seen in the mind and which he put before his fellows as a statue and a mirror of intellectual beauty? And amongst this man again and again returns to these descriptions of heat. So notice how in these descriptions of the boy, it's always like what rigor, what precision. It's his every movement. It's not just his beauty, it's everything about this boy. And it all takes place in this heat, this uncharacteristic heat of the summer that's making Venice so hot. It's the heat of desire, the heat of being unable to suppress your earnings, your urges. And I think he's starting to realize that actually he's obsessed with Tadzio a little bit too much, because he tries to make his obsession intellectual. He begins to compare his beauty and the music of his speech to the beauty of art, to the beauty of writing. He thinks this is why it's like looking at Tadzio and producing a sculpture from marble. Looking at the boy is like looking at beauty, and so he begins to call him his Phaedrus, young Phaedrus. It's a reference to Plato's work specifically on desire, this idea that beauty makes us somehow closer to heaven, and the poets and the artists and the creatives are the vessels that help us achieve this journey towards heaven. In fact, they're like our spiritual guides, and so he begins to think that Tadzio is his muse, to use these academic ideas to justify his sudden obsession. In the sun, he's thinking of all these ideas, this beauty, and he suddenly becomes transported to something like a vision, like a dream, where Socrates was instructing Phaedrus in matters of desire and virtue. So he feels like he himself is in Athens and he's watching this going on. He's watching Socrates like instruct the young boy, and he feels like it's actually at the same time him. He's undergoing something similar, and so he sees him telling him that beauty is the key to achieving enlightenment. The way that he so easily has this vision or this dream because of the heat that is making him sleepy or a little bit delirious also indicates just how quickly he has lost control over his psyche, just how quickly he has given way into the Dionysian. And so he begins to think of Tadzio and how he will write in his presence. Moreover, he would do the work in Tadzio's presence, taking the figure of the boy as a standard for his writing, making his style follow the lines of this body which seemed godlike to him, carrying his beauty over into the spiritual just as the eagle once carried the Trojan shepherd up into the ether. Never had his joy in words been more sweet. And it's sweet precisely because he has given way to his desires, because he has ceased to repress him, whereas before his work was rigorous and bitter because it took so much from him. This time he's deriving pleasure from his work, and it almost feels like he's gone back to his youth. Tadzio is making him feel young, which is perhaps also a part of this pleasure and this obsession, because in his youth he used to draw on life experiences to write, and as he got older, not so much. And he thinks to himself that actually perhaps it's a good thing that readers will not suspect that he's drawing from his own life, because this will not really be approved of. It's admitted that this will not be approved of. Tadzio's beauty in the forming of his little tract, a page and a half of choice, certainly is better for people to know the beautiful product only as finished, not in its conception, its conditions of origin. For knowledge of the sources from which the artist derives his inspiration would often confuse and alienate, and in this way detract from the effects of his mastery. And he also remarks now that actually he's writing more than ever. Yes, he's abandoned his discipline, his routine, but it doesn't mean that he's not writing. But in fact, every time he puts down the pen, he feels tired and almost deranged, as if he has engaged in an act of debauchery. And it's interesting to realize that he actually does admit to himself that something is wrong, that people should not find out about this because it's wrong, and also because, like, even in the act of writing, he himself feels worn out. He knows that this is not correct. And so the next day, he decides to build the courage and go up to Tadzio and introduce himself. and as he walks past him, he realizes he can't. He can't make this acquaintance because Tadzio is his muse, and whenever he stays his muse, he can justify his obsessions. It's also a very fine critique of what exactly is wrong in this and the delusions that Gustav specifically has, because he tells himself, oh, of course, like, I'm just not going to introduce myself, like, oh, Tadzio is just my inspiration. But in reality, by distancing himself from the person, he can distance himself from the act that is wrong in all sorts of senses. And so he begins to live contentedly, and he's no longer waiting for the day to end. He's no longer rushing off anywhere. In fact, he goes to the beach early every morning to be the first one to see Tadzio, and he leaves the latest. His day ends with watching him leave. In watching the sunset, he also feels as if he's reminded of the emotions of the boy. When Tadzio had disappeared from the scene, the day seemed over. And his decision to stay here with no plans just shows how increasingly he's becoming less disciplined, and how it has stopped being a short vacation, and he's making more and more allusions to mythology, to Eos, to describe the sun like Eos, the goddess of the sunrise, to the waves as Poseidon's horses, to further compare Tadzio to different gods like Apollo, the god of the sun. More and more of these descriptions show he's living in the world of fantasy. Aschenbach was no longer given to self-criticism. His taste, the mental caliber of his years, his self-respect, rightness, and a belated simplicity made him unwilling to dismember his motives, to debate whether it was his conscience or, in the contrary, dissoluteness and weakness that had prevented him from carrying out his plans. And I also think it's interesting to look at how he compares to that old man he saw on the boat coming to Venice, who was acting like a young man. He himself remarks that he had stifled with his rigorous impact of life past emotions and past afflictions, and now, merely looking at Tadzio, they were coming back, and even when he's dreaming, he's smiling and his lips are forming the name of Tadzio. It's Tadzio that's being the key to unlocking his desires, which he had for so long suppressed. It's Tadzio that makes him remember his youth, and it's eerie that he begins to compare Tadzio to Hyacinthus, which again never grew old, so it's again that desire for Tadzio to never grow old. And he now begins to actually consider him more and more in terms of his desire, and to consider him, to look for him, to seek out contact with him. And Mann remarks on this delicate relationship that people have who don't know each other on vacation but see each other every day. So they walk around each other, they see each other, but yet by their own sort of thoughts and different upbringings, they feel like they shouldn't really engage because they're strangers, they're on vacation, and so they find that they're putting the effort in, because not into getting to know each other because they don't want to make that effort, but in fact the effort goes into pretending that you don't know each other, even as you're avoiding each other's eyes and walking away. There's a restless energy in this, the hysteria of an unsatisfied, unnaturally repressed desire for acquaintanceship and interchange, and especially there's a kind of tense respect, for one person loves and honors another so long as he cannot judge him, and desire is a product of incomplete knowledge. And he begins to think that when he walks behind him, the boy has a searching look in his eye. He thinks that Tadzio is merely shy. Of course he wants to interact with me. It's only his breeding which kept him from turning around. Already our conversation begins to center on desire rather than artistic inspiration. Already he begins to delude himself that of course Tadzio is returning his affection. And one evening he's sad to notice that the boy is not at the hotel. He begins to worry and fret, but no, the family have merely left to dine out into the city, and he meets them in the hotel lobby after asking where they have gone. And he can't stop himself from showing how happy he is. And I'm about to read you a very long quote that I think is integral to understanding this work, so bear with me. Pleasure, surprise, admiration must have shone on his face as his eyes met those of the boy, and at this moment it happened that Tadzio smiled to him eloquently, familiarly, charmingly, without concealment, and during the smile his lips slowly opened. It was the smile of Narcissus, bent over the reflecting water, that deep, fascinated, magnetic smile with which he stretched out his arms to the image of his own beauty, a smile distorted ever so little, distorted at the hopelessness of his efforts to kiss the pure lips of the shadow. It was coquettish, inquisitive, slightly tortured. It was infatuating. He had received the smile. He hurried away as though he bore a fatal gift. He was so shaken that he had to flee the light of the terrace in the front garden. He hastily hunted out the darkness of the park in the rear. Strangely indignant and tender admonitions wrung themselves out of him. You dare not smile like that. Listen, no one dare smile like that to another. He threw himself down on a bench. In a frenzy, he breathed the night smell of the vegetation. Leaning back, his arms loose, overwhelmed, with shivers running through him, whispered the fixed formula of desire. Impossible in this case, absurd, abject, ridiculous, and yet holy. Even in this case, venerable. I love you. Once he sees him smiling, he's shocked. He can't bear it. That's why he flees. That's why he escapes the situation, because he's not quite ready to confront it. And in that garden, in that intoxicating smell of flowers and heat, that's when he admits to himself that he loves him. He's an artist. Oh, it's perfectly alright for me to hold this desire because it's for spiritual enlightenment. It's the pursuit of beauty. It's all of these justifications. It's also significant that he compares his smile to that of Narcissus. It's that story of a boy who was so pretty that everyone loved him, and one day he went to the lake. There were even two gods who warred over their love for him, and it was sad because he could never really love anyone. But that day when he went to the lake, he saw himself in the reflection and he fell in love with himself because there was no one who was more beautiful than him. And so he spent all his time staring at the lake. In some versions of the story he drowned, in other versions he simply turned to stone. And where he died, or where he turned to stone and then crumbled to disappear, there grows the yellow flower. And it's also significant that we call it like Narcissus. He's a narcissist because he's self-obsessed. Narcissus has become an adjective. He's the symbol of self-obsession, and he's also the symbol of beauty that can be fatal. It's a warning that this beauty will be fatal. Just like Narcissus could not stop loving his reflection, he cannot stop loving Tadzio. So again, a part of him is actually realizing just how doomed this relationship is, but he just can't tear himself away from it. And it's interesting to ask, who exactly is Narcissus here? Is it really the boy, or is it merely himself? Because it's a symbol of the selfishness that he has finally let go of his desires and projected them not onto a woman his age, but onto an innocent young boy who's trying to enjoy a family holiday. It would be such an interesting book to compare to Lolita, and in the ways that Eschenbach and Humbert try to justify their obsessions and to claim that it's the children who somehow drove them towards this. Chapter 5. And so begins his 4th week at the hotel, and he notices that, strangely enough, the hotel is getting emptier and emptier, and there are less and less German families, to the point where he's practically surrounded by foreign families and foreign speech. It's also eerie that when he goes to the barber and remarks, "Oh, look how many families have left," the barber's like, "Well, of course the German families left, it's because of the plague." And so he asks, "What plague?" And the barber is quickly terrified and shuts up. One day, again under a spell of desire that's super intense, he's driven to follow the Polish family because he thought he saw them going in the direction of Pier, and he can't bear the thought of them leaving. Notice that he doesn't actually have a plan of what he's going to do if they do leave. He's behaving completely spontaneously. If we're going by stereotypes of what is like German, what is stereotypically German, in fact it does go accordingly with this idea of this Munich German European spirit of rigor and discipline that we talked about in the former video. He's behaving decidedly anti-German, anti-European because he doesn't have a plan. He just gets up and follows them, and as he walks around the city he notices this very sweet and strange smell. And he recognizes the smell, even if it's not explicitly said at this point, but I'm sure you understand what it is. We've lived through COVID. He recognizes the smell, and he thinks how suspicious this is, and he sees all sorts of posters advertising that there is gastric illness and that people should be careful. Do not eat clams, to avoid water. And so he walks around and he finally goes into the shop and he says, "Well, why is there so much of the smell?" And the man answers, "Oh, it's simply precautions, sir, nothing to worry about." And he thanked him and went on, and on the steamer back he caught the smell of the disinfectant. So COVID flashbacks. It is in fact disinfectant that's spreading all across the city, and everybody seems to be denying that there's some sort of plague. It's the hotel, and he immediately goes to the newspapers to try and see what the source is. But there really isn't anything decisive in the newspapers that will tell him what's going on. Is there a plague? Is there no plague? He realizes with a strange sense of satisfaction that actually he's happy that there's no definitive answer, because he doesn't really want Tadzio to leave, that he would not know how to go on living if this occurred, if Tadzio leaves. And the book then begins to describe how lately he has been increasingly behaving more and more like a stalker, that he's been going around and following Tadzio more openly now. He has went into the city to follow them into a church, because as he discovered, they go to church on Sundays, and he stood among the praying people watching Tadzio. So he's going into a church, the symbol of purity, the symbol of worship, and he's just completely like muddying it with his unholy desires, and he's not even trying to hide it. And at one point they get on a boat, and he literally pays a gondolier more money for him to follow them secretly on this boat. So he's investing his time and his resources into it now. He's gone on to the point of no return. Previously he just sat on the beach and he could have said, oh, like, I'm just waking up early, it's normal anyway. No, now he's expending conscious effort to follow Tadzio, to behave in a stalkerish manner. And at times he stops himself and asks himself, well, what would my ancestors say? But he quickly justifies it. What would they say? But then what would they have said to his whole life, which was almost degenerate in its departure from theirs? This life under the spell of art, a life against which he himself had once issued such youthful mockeries out of loyalty to his fathers, but which at bottom had been so much like theirs. He too had served, he too had been a soldier and a warrior like many of them, for art was a war, a destructive battle, and one was not equal to it for long these days. For his art he is willing to suffer, and if they disapprove, so what? They would have disapproved of his whole life. And meanwhile he's treating the boy as an extension to his art. Of course he's integral to my journey as an artist, so it doesn't matter if they would disapprove, because if they're disapproving of Tadzio, they're disapproving of art, and I have given my whole life to art anyway. And meanwhile the plague keeps spreading across Venice, and the number of sick people keep growing, and it's mentioned in passing, and then it's, oh, look how beautiful Tadzio is, all over again. And the authorities don't take definitive measures. Certainty was impossible. It's hard to know what is going on. It's hard to know how safe you are. And I can't help but feel that this is mirroring the First World War. Neither could you know if war was approaching, if war was imminent, if you would be recruited, if you would die. And then a group of performers enter as he's looking at Tadzio back in the hotel for dinner, and they perform some sort of cheap entertainment show, and again Gustav is focused on how old they are, pulling all these grimaces and behaving like clowns. At their age, of course not. And then all the while he's observing Tadzio. It had also seemed to him that Tadzio's occasional stretching and quick breathing indicated a complaint, a congestion of the lungs. He's sickly, he will probably not grow old, he thought repeatedly with that positiveness, which is often a peculiar relief to desire and passion, and along with pure solicitude, he had a feeling of rakish gratification. So he feels delighted in knowing that Tadzio is sick. He wishes again for him to remain forever young. It's not just that runaway intrusive thought that we had earlier on in the book. No, it's carried through. It's his conscious thought that he wants him to stay young. But it is also important to know that even as he's thinking of the boy, the plague is not exactly off of his mind. So he does inquire of the performer, like, oh, is there a plague? And he says, oh, what plague? No, the police are handling it. Don't you have trust in our authorities? And he's really putting on a show. So he can tell that he's being fake and that there's information in what he's giving him. So he pays him handsomely. And as he walks away, he sees that actually the hotel staff are questioning the performer. So no, nobody's allowed to talk about this. And it's ironic perhaps that he's so obsessed with Tadzio when he should really be obsessed with the disease, but perhaps the only reason he's thinking of the disease is because he doesn't want Tadzio to leave. The narrative centers around the lover, how Mann begins to refer to Gustav, but all the while death is following, things are falling apart, there is death in Venice. And after the performance, which is made dirty by the guitarist's constant innuendos, he begins to reflect on his childhood, and in this reflection, in this dream, in this haze, which more and more often begins to target him, he sees an hourglass, the hourglass that his parents had. Of course, it's significant that it's an allusion to his parent, Freud theory and all of that, but I specifically want to focus on the symbol of the hourglass. It's the fact that time is running out. It's a very explicit symbol. Mann is literally shoving it into the reader's face and saying, Gustav's time is running out, Tadzio's time is running out, death is spreading, and their time together is running out. And again, this links back to what I said about how hard it is to not be completely biographical in our approach to analyzing this work, because in fact it's inspired by a true story. It's inspired by Mann's own vacation in Venice. He had his own Tadzio, and in fact Gustav could be a reference to Gustav Mahler, the composer who died in the year in which this novel is set. And of course this uncertainty, these officials, this constant going back and forth of whether or not there is a crisis, it seems to me like this is much like the piece of Europe crumbling in the lead up to the First World War. And the next day Gustav breaks out of it and he decides to question the officials. So here is the fact breakdown. There's an Asiatic cholera that has been born in swamps, easily spread. It's born where the tiger crouches. Again, remember that vision Gustav had earlier on. Now it's spreading. He didn't come to the tiger came to him. As in early May, there have been 2 cases in Venice. The authorities did not sound the alarm. There's more and more death. It's only that an Austrian came back from Venice and died that other countries have begun to find out, and likely the food supply has been infected. Denied and glossed over, death was eating its way along the narrow streets, and its dissemination was especially favored by the premature summer heat which warmed the water of the canal. More facts. Recovery is rare. Out of 180 people die. People find themselves dried out from the inside. Because they fear the loss of profit, especially if tourists stop coming to Venice, the authorities stay silent. Those who challenge the authorities are replaced, and cases of death are simply blamed on increasing crime rates. And the clerk advises him to leave as soon as possible, because surely any moment now a quarantine will be declared. And so he walks away and he feels this fear, but then he thinks to himself, oh, but isn't this a beautiful opportunity? I can go to Tadzio's mother and make this majestic speech telling her to save her daughters and Tadzio. But then of course no, he admits to himself. Thoughts of returning home, of prudence, soberness, effort, mastery disgusted him to such an extent that his face was distorted with an expression of physical nausea. It must be kept quiet, he whispered fiercely, and I will be quiet. And so he keeps quiet. And as he stays quiet, there are descriptions of more and more people falling victim to this plague. And one night he has this strange, fitful dream of, in this dream there's this god and there's night approaching, and there's this sense of fear because there's women running away and men trying to fight this approach, but at the same time it's like fear mixed with desire, because it's like women dancing and swaying and men playing the flute and there's beating of the drums, and it all seems like one fun sexual relationships party because everybody's hurling each other into each other in a way to sacrifice to the god. And this of course is a vision of Dionysus. They are hurling themselves in this Dionysian style revelry, in this debauchery, in exactly the way that Dionysus, the god of wine and entertainment, would promote. And even in his dream he tastes this unchastity and fury of decay. And so someone has let the secret out as it goes, and more people are leaving, urgently scrambling away to save themselves, but Tadzio and his mother remain, and as they remain he finds himself driven more and more of being noticed, of being appreciated, and so he starts to put in more effort and more care into his appearance. He goes to the barber and he asks, oh no, I have gray hair, and the barber tells him that's nothing, we can't fix. So he paints his hair. He then uses makeup to touch up his skin, to give color to his face, to put on bright clothes and jewels. After all this manipulation, he beheld a blossoming youth, in a fever representing the hot passion that he feels for Tadzio and his desire to not admit that actually he's exactly like that old man coming to Venice. He feels a sense of turmoil driving him forward to once again follow Tadzio, and he loses Tadzio out of sight and he becomes lost in this maze in the city. He finds them crossing the bridge somewhere, and of course the bridge represents a metaphorical path from the land of living to land of death. It's again a sign of his imminent death to come, and he feels that he's so thirsty. Oh no, the plague that makes us dried up from the inside. So he goes to a stall and buys ripe strawberries, again food which you should not consume. And so by this feeling of thirst and exhaustion, he sits down on a square in the heat, and he again has this vision of himself talking to fighters. He begins to address himself to fighters and to ask himself whether beauty is indeed the path to wisdom or if beauty is the path to the abyss. He seems to conclude that it leads to the end, to the destroyal of a life. He admits to himself his life has been destroyed. They lead us poets thus, I say, since we cannot lift ourselves up and can but let ourselves loose. And now I'm going, fighters, you stay here, and when you no longer see me, then you go too. A few days after that incident, he wakes up later, far later than usual, and he feels drugged and weary. And so he goes out through the lobby in the direction of the beach, and he sees suitcases and he asks who's leaving, but of course he knows the answer. It's Tadzio and his family. And so he goes to the beach despondently and notices that the beach is far less welcoming than usual. The sand is dirty, it's abandoned, and he notices that Tadzio is playing with his friends, so at least that is usual, and he sits down in a chair to watch them, but he notices that the game quickly dissolves into degeneracy, and Tadzio is not so popular with his playmates anymore. In fact, the boy who we have previously seen walking around with Tadzio arm in arm like the best of friends is trying to strangle him because Tadzio has thrown some sand, and he's strangling him for so long that Gustav thinks, surely I must interfere now, and the boy is going limp, and oh no, is he going to keep on living? But no, the boy lets him be, he stops strangling him, and Tadzio simply gets up and brushes himself off and walks away in the direction of the sea, and he ignores the fact that his playmates worriedly call for him, Tadzio, Tadzio, come back. And as he walks into this path into the sea, he's turning around and he's smiling and he's beckoning for Gustav to join him. Again, that sea, the symbol of the unexplored mind, and so he gets up and he decides, oh sure, I'll follow him. In his dream, he's following him because in reality the people on the beach see that he's slumping more and more into his chair, while in his dream he's on the contrary getting up and following him through. Of course he'll follow, it's Tadzio. Some time passes and then it's noted that Gustav has collapsed and died, and the world is informed of his death and they are respectfully shocked. So in his final moments, Tadzio represented death and the doom of these relationships. It is he who has beckoned Gustav to follow him into death, into the other side. The world, meanwhile, lived blissfully ignorant of all that has occurred into Gustav's death. They think only of the art and not of the man, not the effort required to put into the art. And in my opinion, it is actually this constant repression of his desires and putting everything into his art and then eventually just letting it all go so suddenly that has led to Gustav's death. Tadzio is of course blameless. Tadzio is simply a young boy. It is Gustav who has projected all of this onto him. It is Gustav who is entirely to blame for both his life spent toiling around his work and his final demise. So please do let me know what you think in the comments. I know this was a massive video, but I hope you found the level of detail interesting and useful. And if you like the summary and analysis, please leave me a like and a comment. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.